This is the Garage Gym Athlete Podcast, and we're here to build autonomous athletes and put phenomenal programming into every garage, basement, and spare bedroom out there. I'm Jerred Moon, and I'm with Joe Courtney. We are strength and conditioning coaches who have turned over 20,000 people into garage gym athletes over the last decade. And we're here to reduce the information overload that exists in the health and fitness industry today. We're going to do that by covering relevant science and give actionable takeaways, not only from the data, but from our years of experience. So let's dive in. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Garage Gym Athlete Podcast. Jerred Moon here, and it's just me today, and we're going to be discussing VO2 Max. The reason I want to cover VO2 Max is it comes up a lot in the Garage Gym Athlete community. People want to know, hey, how do I improve my VO2 Max? What are ways to do it? And maybe you're not a runner who just wants to, do tempo runs and long duration runs all the time. Are there other ways to improve your VO2 Max? So today I'm going to be going over 11 different ways you can actually improve your VO2 Max. Some of them will be running, but I want this to be a kind of a deeper dive than that and hit it at more of a conceptual level, because you could Google, hey, what are the top 10, 11 ways, whatever, I could improve my VO2 Max, and you'll have a perfectly SEO optimized article written by AI from some random website that can tell you some random ways to improve your VO2 Max. But I don't think that helps the athlete very much. That doesn't help you put things into practice. So while I will mention some specific training sessions that you might be able to do, or types of training sessions that you can do, I do want to talk about it at a broad general level, because that's how my brain processes things as a coach and programmer. Is when I can understand things in a very simple way, then I can start to utilize the concept more easily in my training and programming. And I think if I can explain it well enough to you today, you'll be able to do the same thing. Before we dive in, I have to briefly go over what VO2 Max is, why you might want to improve it. So VO2 Max is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use during intense exercise. It's measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. It reflects your aerobic fitness level and cardiovascular efficiency, showing how well your heart, lungs, and muscles work together to deliver and use oxygen during physical activity. So why would you want to improve it? Well, one, it is highly linked to longevity. It says that the research says maintaining a higher VO2 max through consistent cardiovascular strength training can significantly improve quality of life and longevity. In some studies suggest VO2 max is better predictor of mortality than traditional risk factors like smoking, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol. It's very important. And it enhances your endurance, allowing you to perform longer and harder before fatigue sets in, which we all want. And in all honesty, it just makes you a better human. The higher your VO2 max, the quicker you're able to recover, the longer you're able to go. It's just the superpower behind what you really want when it comes to having any kind of performance goal. VO2 max is going to help you be a very capable human being. So that's the brief what is VO2 max. Let's get into the nitty gritty, and I'm going to start at this conceptual level. Like I said, I want you to understand like this big picture what VO2 max is, and then we can start tactical program, like how to hit sessions, all those kind of things. But ultimately, VO2 max is your body's ability to utilize oxygen, and that's it. So if we know that that's all it is, and we're just trying to improve the efficiency of that, we want the body to be able to use more oxygen, then what do? Well, you have to do activities that demand a standard use of oxygen, like a standard rate or a sustained rate of use of oxygen. So you can think of like longer runs or whatever. So that will demand oxygen, right? Because just think about it. Again, conceptual level, you're running, you're having to breathe. When you're breathing, you're utilizing oxygen. If you're utilizing oxygen, you're doing something that has to do with your VO2 max. But the other way to think about it is, how can I create an oxygen debt? Okay, now think about what you're doing these short duration, short burst activities, and you're having to put your hands on your knees to recover. You're breathing heavily, and then you're finally, recovering, and you're getting back. But there's a lot of breathing involved, right? And those are the two big ways I look at VO2 max, is okay, how can I use oxygen in a sustained way, or how can I create oxygen debt? And that is it in a nutshell. If you can understand that at a conceptual level, you don't have to worry so much about, am I doing the right work to rest ratio during my tempo run or during my sprint intervals? Or am I in the right heart rate zone for this long duration run? Those things are, important to some degree, because there's science behind them that says, hey, here are what we've kind of uncovered. We think zone two is great for sustained oxygen efficiency for long duration. Or we think getting to 85 to 95% with a 1-to-3 work to rest ratio is great for improving VO2 max. Again, science comes out with all of these correlations and best practices, and then we can talk about it and, do our best to program it. But if you're just thinking about it at the U level, now we can get away from, well, do I have to run 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds? Well, I don't know. I don't know how fit you are. So you start to answer that question. Is the interval I'm doing creating an oxygen debt? If I was doing sprint intervals, is it creating an oxygen debt? Am I having to breathe a lot after? I wouldn't be able to sustain this. Am I creating an oxygen debt? Now, there are two forms of oxygen debt. There's oxygen debt like immediate, like in between intervals. You're breathing really heavy. You're trying to recover, not fully recover, but you're trying to recover. And then once you recover to some degree, you hit the other interval, right? Again, you're not 100% recovered because you don't actually want to go there. And we'll talk about that more. But then when you do, most every exercise is going to have post oxygen consumption to where you're going to be consuming additional oxygen throughout the day or for longer duration after during the recovery period to get that oxygen back. It can even happen during heavy strength training sessions. But ultimately, now we're down to the U level. Am I creating an oxygen debt? So if you are, and that's challenging your system, you're breathing hard, you're breathing heavy, it's hard for you to recover, you are working on improving your VO2 max. And I'm hoping, telling you in a very simple format before we get super technical or like here are the exact things that you can do. I hope that alleviates some of the mysticism behind improving your VO2 max. So if you're doing intervals and it's creating an oxygen debt and you're not fully recovering, but you are recovering, you are getting ahead of that debt. Think about if this was to be a credit card and you spent $1,000 on your credit card. Well, now you're in debt. Well, you don't want to pay off the full debt. You want to pay off like 80% of it. And so that's how the recovery. You're like, I'm going to pay off $800 of this. So, okay, cool. I'm still in some oxygen debt, but I need to go again. So if you're creating oxygen debt, you're improving your VO2 max. And then also if you're utilizing oxygen for a sustained period, meaning you just can do that, you're also finding ways to improve your VO2 max. And you can do that with a kettlebell. You can do that walking. You can do that running. You can do that through strength training, mixed modalities, EMOMs, interval weight training, CrossFit. You can do all these different things, and you can put it in one of these two buckets. Am I able to sustain this for long duration and utilize oxygen, or am I creating an oxygen debt? If you're doing one of those two things, you are working on the improvement of your VO2 max. Now, if we get down into the nitty gritty, let's go over kind of the heart rate zones that you want to consider for improving VO2 max. And we'll start with the lower and the activities that you can do. First is going to be zone 2. I've already mentioned it, 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. We've talked a lot about zone 2 on this podcast. There's plenty of, if you want to search our feed for zone 2, you'll find plenty of information, but basically steady state. Again, how can I sustain this activity for long duration? If you're sustaining it for long duration, you are now improving your VO2 max. But what this is doing is actually improving it's kind of base training is what we call it. It's not going to actually be the thing that improves your VO2 max, but it's part of the bigger picture that will help you get there. Because again, you need two things. You need to be able to sustain oxygen consumption, and you need to create oxygen debt. Now, as we move up in intensity, we get away from zone 2, we get into the 70 to 85% heart rate zone. And this is where things like high rep strength training, muscular endurance, concurrent training, these kind of things can fit in. This is where we might be blending the lines a little bit, blurring the lines. And this is where I, hope more and more research starts to come out, because almost all VO2 max researches are done on like cyclists and runners and those kind of things. And like I said, there is some more on mixed modality, but not a ton in comparison to the others. But if we're starting to do high rep strength training, think about the EMOMs that I'm talking about, or if you're just straight doing strength training with 20 rep sets and concurrent training. And when I'm saying concurrent training, I'm talking not like Monday strength, Tuesday running. I'm talking about concurrent training where you're blending something in the single session, where if you think about something like, just the combination of, push-ups and running, something like that, those kind of things, if you can get into that 70 to 85%, you're utilizing more muscle mass and more oxygen. And that's why I think that there should be more research done here, because you're creating a oxygen debt when you're in these different zones, right? When you're doing high rep strength activities or when you are doing concurrent training. So anyway, you want to be in that 70 to 85% category there. 80 to 90% is going to be tempo runs in interval weight training. So again, I did an entire podcast on interval weight training. What it is, simply you will do some sort of heavy loaded barbell movement, or it could be a kettlebell movement. But let's say you do 6 reps of front squat, or 4 reps or 8 reps of front squat, and then you immediately run at a higher intensity for 1, 2, 3, 4 minutes. Then you will rest, recover. Again, we created a ton of oxygen debt. Think about that. Interval weight training is creating so much of an oxygen debt. If you've ever done interval weight training, you've felt it. It feels worse than like a normal running interval, because once you get into them, it gets worse and worse because there's so much of an oxygen debt from a heavy barbell movement. And then to go put in yourself into something really aerobic, like run, sustained for 3 minutes, very, very taxing on the system. But then you get that recovery period, and the recovery period is so important. And we will talk about that more. So tempo runs are just, you can think of these like threshold runs. It's kind of like intervals, but you're holding the intervals for a little bit longer. And those typically 80, 85%. Now, when we get up to the very top end, 85 to 95%, really don't need to ever really go above 95%. You're going to be looking at things like sprints. So short duration sprints, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 45 seconds, something like that. You don't want to go too short on the sprints. If you're doing, let's say, 5 to 10 second sprints, super short, you're training a different energy system, a lactic energy system, which is the very low end, which is an important energy system, in my opinion, for being athletic, explosive, power, all of those things. But this energy system can almost be ignored when we're talking about just VO2 max production. That's why I don't think you should only focus on VO2 max production. VO2 max is more getting into the lactic or glycolytic energy system and oxidative or aerobic energy system, and not as much of the alactic. So anyway, sprints are going to do this. Again, you want longer than 10 seconds is the best advice I can give you for the sprints, and then a 1-to-1 or 1-to-3 work to rest ratio. You can do fartleks, which I really like for sprint interval training. So this is where you don't have a specific distance every single time. You can do this easily if you're like running around your neighborhood. Again, you're going to want to shoot for something that's a little bit longer than 10 seconds. It can be 20 seconds. So that's the only thing I'd keep in mind. Be like, but it'll be different every time. But longer than 10 seconds is the only thing I want to keep in your head. And so if I were to like, hey, run to the end of this street, and then you run to that end of the street, and then you walk until you feel about that 80% recovery, 70% recovery. And then you run again, but this time it's going to be shorter. I'm going to run to that tree. And then you just keep going through this for maybe a 30-minute session. But the point is, you should be going hard in the running portions, and you should be recovering well. So sprints are fartleks. The next two are high-intensity interval training and high-intensity functional training. So high-intensity interval training is very simple. It's typically cardiovascular based. So it could be doing burpees, burpee broad jumps for a set amount of time and then resting. So something like that. It could be jump rope, whatever is going to create a significant oxygen debt, but also that heart rate getting up to 85 to 95% and then coming back down. Now, what's emerging more in literature is HIFT, high intensity functional training, where they are looking at things that are more mixed modality in nature. You could even think of a workout like Murph, because if you are doing Murph at a high intensity, you're going to be doing, depending on, let's say you're doing a half Murph to a full Murph, anywhere in between there, you're going to be going high intensity. They're functional movements, pull ups and squats, and you're running, and it has a very high energy demand. It's not uncommon for people to be in this 85 to 95% category for a workout like Murph, or heart rate zone for a workout like Murph. And so these mixed modal training sessions can be very beneficial if your heart rate's getting high enough. Because there are two ways to approach. If we're just talking about the workout Murph, and if you're unfamiliar with the workout Murph, it's run 1 mile, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, run 1 mile. And typically the calisthenics are done in sets of 5, 10, 15. But if we were to look at that workout, we've programmed it two different ways at Garage Gym Athlete, where one, go as fast as you possibly can, which would be in the 85 to 95% heart rate category. And some people might, be a little bit below that, but that's fine. And we've also programmed zone 2 Murph, where you complete the workout Murph, you're time capped at an hour, but you don't let your heart rate get out of zone 2. And you see how this is where I'm trying to challenge the status quo a little bit. Is like, well, all we're trying to do is either create an oxygen debt to make my body more efficient at utilizing oxygen, and I can do that by doing Murph at a really high intensity, or I can find a way to do this same workout, but I'm just going to have sustained oxygen use throughout that I can constantly recover from. My body can just continuously do, the sustained oxygen use. So I can do Murph, but forget the intensity. Don't let my heart rate get out of zone 2, that's 60 to 70%. Now I'm in steady state. I'm still having an oxygen demand on the body where my heart rate needs to be. See how you can utilize the same workout for the same goal. You can use it in different ways just based on the intensity. So anyway, there are a lot of different ways that you could peel this out, but that's the big broad way to tackle it if we're talking about the session level for VO2 max. And so I mentioned 8 different ones there. Again, going in order from lower heart rate to higher heart rate, steady state, high rep strength training, concurrent training, tempo runs, interval weight training, high intensity interval training, sprints, fartlek, and high intensity functional training are all great ways to increase your VO2 max. But there are other things that we have to take into account, because I don't just talking about, hey, yeah, go do those sessions, do it once per week, and you'll be good to go. You'll increase your VO2 max. The main thing that we're looking to do on a consistent basis is utilize oxygen for sustained periods and create an oxygen debt. Now, the other thing that you have to think about is your pacing and your recovery. So this is more of the how, and then we'll talk about how you need to program it after this. So pacing and recovery are very important. I've kind of mentioned it by putting heart rate zones to these things, but the unfortunate thing sometimes is if you just did Google, like, what's a good VO2 max workout? And it's, okay, we'll go to the track, run 200s, rest 60 seconds, and keep doing that. And no doubt, if you're like not in the best shape, that will create an oxygen debt, and you will, increase your VO2 max. And the reason I said if you're out of shape is because you can almost do anything and it'll start creeping up the VO2 max. What gets problematic or more challenging is if you start to gain a significant fitness level. You have a VO2 max above 50, or you're touching 60, or maybe even you're above. It becomes way more difficult to improve VO2 max by just doing some random workout like that. So you really have to pay attention to your pacing over time. So this is something that you want to keep track of when you are doing the workouts. So if I'm running 400s, and I really like 400s as my modality, if I'm just talking about running, then I want to know how fast I could do 400s. And I want to know what my pacing is and what my heart rate was. And we don't have to get much further than that, but let's say I'm running 400s in a minute and a half, say 90 seconds, and that is, my heart rate's where it needs to be. I'm doing this for 90 seconds. Well, can I eventually start to decrease that pace? Because we don't want to just always keep things the same. This is how programming works. Is like there should be an increased challenge for the body. So can I decrease that time? Can I go a little bit faster by 1 second, 2 seconds after a couple weeks of doing this? And then the second thing you want to pay attention to is something I've mentioned already that I said we talk more about, is recovery. Recovery is so important. And this is often overlooked. And this is, again, why I don't like for people to Google this cookie cutter. Okay, I want a VO2 max training session. How long should I rest? And then you read this random article and it's, yeah, rest 60 seconds. Like, according to what? Like, why? Like, why rest 60 seconds? And again, this goes back to this Goldilocks zone of rest when you're trying to do VO2 max stuff. Because if you rest too long, like you fully recover, like you're good to go, that's not you're not putting enough demand on on your system, enough oxygen demand to have a good workout, because you want fatigue to set in to some degree. You want to get tired. You want your body to be challenged. Again, start to create some of that oxygen debt. You want to be challenged there. You don't want to fully recover when you're doing like intervals or any of these types of things. But at the same time, you don't want to not recover at all. You don't want to have this like no recovery time. Because when you get no recovery time, yeah, what's happening is you're not actually being very strategic about your training anymore. What's actually happening is just a ton of fatigue. And that's where a lot of people, I think, mess up, their VO2 max or just training in general, is fatigue starts to dominate their training. And so they think being tired is a good thing. It's all cool. Yeah, I'm really tired from this workout. So yes, you burned calories, you did something great. But we're talking about VO2 max. We're not talking about losing weight. We're talking about performance. We're not talking about how many calories you burned, right? Once you get into that mentality, this performance mentality, all these other things start to matter. Okay, we're a step away from, okay, yeah, let's be consistent, do our workouts. Okay, you're doing that. How do I increase my VO2 max? Well, you don't want fatigue to dominate, because if fatigue dominates, you can't actually hit the sessions as hard as you want. You're not getting the heart rate zones where you need to. You might shift too much to an anaerobic performance. So the anaerobic energy system is going to be used during subsequent intervals. So we're not actually training the oxidative system how we want to anymore. You can risk overtraining, and you won't be able to maintain your intensity, like I talked about with fatigue in general. So there is a Goldilocks zone. Research typically says, depending on the interval, it's 1-to-1 work to rest or 1-to-3 work to rest, somewhere along those lines. But I want to urge athletes to listen to your body. Okay? The chances are pretty low that you will recover all the way. So I don't want you to worry too much about that one. There is this Goldilocks zone, but typically if I go as hard as I can, or you go as hard as you can in a 400 meter, or we're going 80-90% as hard as we can in a 400 meter, and then we stop to rest, our full recovery time might be 5 to 10 minutes. And so let's call it 10 minutes, where we're just like, heart rate is back, nearly to resting. Like I'm good to go. I'm not breathing hard anymore. I am just like, I'm ready. You don't want to get to that level, but it also takes so much time that it's not realistic for people to do in a workout. So I don't think most people are hitting full recovery. So that one you don't need to worry about as much. The one that is way, way more prevalent and common is resting too little. And that's actually not very good for you when you're trying to be strategic in increasing your VO2 max. And I think this is the predominant problem people are doing, or making, the mistake they're making when it comes to interval training, is they're resting too short. So look at that 1-to-1, 1-to-3. The shorter the duration, the longer, the shorter duration, that's where 1-to-3 comes in. The longer duration, that's where 1-to-1 would come in when we're talking about interval training or any of this kind of stuff. Now, if we look at that, okay, well, that fits in. You're talking about pacing and recovery for mainly high-intensity interval training, high-intensity functional training, sprints, and fartleks. That's where pacing and recovery comes in. Same with tempo runs and interval weight training. Okay, so how hard you go during matters, and then can we get it a little bit faster? And then also the recovery. Again, the recovery train for interval weight training, we might say rest 2-3 minutes. But ultimately, the goal is rest, don't fully recover, but don't rest too short to where you're walking into the next interval and your heart rate's still in zone 4. That's not what we want. And then it also matters in high rep strength training and concurrent training, because you don't want to sustain for too long. You want to create some oxygen debt. And then steady state interval training, or steady state training, something like zone 2, a long run. The recovery is not really a factor as much, because you are actually almost recovering as you're running. Like that's the whole point of the sustained oxygen consumption in zone 2, is we're just trying to utilize as much oxygen as possible for long duration so our body gets accustomed to it. But there's not a lot of recovery involved. It's more the pace. So you need to hit the pace because recovery is happening. So pacing and recovery are so very important when it comes to the execution of your VO2 max training. And then another on the how to before we move into the last thing will be improve your movement economy. I talked about this in the running backwards episode that we did recently, and how run economy is actually a better predictor of race performance than VO2 max, which is pretty phenomenal. But also, run economy is correlated with a better VO2 max, because basically the more efficient you can be, the better your body is going to be at utilizing oxygen during specific movements. Because if I didn't say this, one thing that you could do is you could just strap dumbbells to your arms and your feet and and put on a weight vest and flail your arms around and run with your legs all crazy. And that would be a great way to cause some oxygen debt, probably get injured as well, right? But ultimately, the point being is if you make things as hard as possible, you would still fit in this category of either using sustained oxygen or creating an oxygen debt. But that's not how the body actually moves, right? And so there's almost no one would do that level of stupidity. But my point being is movement economy is very important the fitter you get. Like at first it won't matter, and most people, to be honest, if you're not very fit, your movement economy in general is probably not very good. But as you gain fitness and your VO2 max improves, it might not just be, hey, what are the tempo runs I should be doing this week? Or what interval weight training can I do? Or what are the HIIT sessions I have this week? Those aren't the only things that you want to look at anymore as your VO2 max starts to creep up. You want to start looking at, how's my movement economy? How's my run economy? How's my movement in, my calisthenic movements if I'm doing more mixed modal training? How are my barbell movements if I'm doing high rep strength training? So movement economy becomes very important because that also makes your body more efficient and can also move the needle with VO2 max. So those are the two things on how to. Pacing and recovery, very important in your movement economy if you want to continually improve your VO2 max. Now, the last thing is programming 101, progressive overload. Progressive overload. You have to be taxing yourself in some way. The body can rapidly increase VO2 max when you first start doing these things, but then it's going to start to slow down, and it starts to slow down, and this is where programming becomes more important because we're no longer challenging ourselves. That's why you can't just say, hey, I'm going to go do 5 400-meter sprints with a 1 to 3 work to rest ratio every day for the next year, and my VO2 max is going to be phenomenal. What will happen is you'll probably increase your VO2 max for 3 or 4 months, and then a lot of the benefits will start to wane. It won't be as good. That's why training exists, right? Like if all we ever had to do was the event we trained for, I mean, that's all Olympic athletes would do. If we talk about track and field athletes, it's, oh, you run the 400 meter? Okay, well, let's just do 400s today. We're just going to run the 400. A bunch of times today, a few times tomorrow, but we won't run any other distance. It's just a 400 as fast as you can. But that's not how training works, right? We have to find ways to incorporate progressive overload, which is making things harder over time with a strategic rest period. I'll talk about that in a second, but making things harder over time. So over time, you are trying to make your intervals a little bit faster, or you're keeping them the same speed and you're adding more volume. Instead of 5 intervals today, it's 6 intervals. And then maybe as you get fitter, it's both. You increase your fitness. So you're like, I'm going to decrease how fast the time it takes me to run each interval. And I'm also going to increase the number of intervals I do. Now, this can't go on in perpetuity, right? So what we do is typically you can go in a wave. How we do it at Garage Gym Athlete is like we would wave that up for 3 weeks. We would back off for a week, maybe do something entirely different, but basically deload, and then pick it up again the next 3-week cycle and, go a little bit harder. Maybe we add reps or decrease time, and then we do another on that 4th week, we deload, and then the final wave for the, to make this 12 weeks, we would do the same thing. So that's progressive overload, and that's what you need to be thinking about when you are trying to increase your VO2 max. But as I mentioned, you can't just get better in perpetuity, or else it'd be so easy to just have the most optimal badass VO2 max in existence. So what you have to do is find different ways to hit it, because there's also the human element, right? The human psyche of that's another reason why we can't just run 400 meters every single day and improve our VO2 max, because we'd get bored as hell. We wouldn't want to do it anymore. So then that's where we can incorporate some 200-meter runs, or we do these other things like high intensity functional training, high rep strength training, concurrent training, throw in some steady state. All these things, they all work towards improving our VO2 max, but they have to be progressive in nature, typically for 4, 8, 12 weeks. And you have to continually challenge your body to have to adapt to a new stimulus. So hopefully this episode was helpful in how to improve your VO2 max. Again, big picture, don't stress too much about it, because if you are using oxygen for a sustained period, whether that's a zone 2 MRF, that's a zone 2 run, that's a walk, whatever, that's checkbox number 1. I am utilizing oxygen for a sustained period. I'm almost able to recover like right as soon as it's happening or shortly after. That's kind of this low duration or low intensity, long duration, sustained use of oxygen. Check that box. And then also, am I creating an oxygen debt? Very easy to know if you're creating an oxygen debt. You'll be breathing very hard. Your body will want that oxygen that it needs because you went too hard. And you could do that with high intensity interval training, sprints, fartleks, high intensity functional training, tempo runs, interval weight training. There are all sorts of ways to create oxygen debt. Then, if you could just think about those two things, you don't have to worry so much about the specific thing that you're doing each and every single day. And I know we don't at Garage Gym Athlete. That's why we're not all hung up on Tuesday being a tempo run every week for, all year. Or, Monday being sprint intervals and Wednesday being zone 2. Because I don't look at it that way, and I don't think that you need to. I say this all the time, but the human body did not come with a user manual. Yes, we have some science out there that points us in the directions of some things, but ultimately, if the broader concept of VO2 max is just utilization of oxygen by the body and becoming more efficient, we can do that in a lot of ways. And if the science hasn't looked at zone 2 MRF versus high intensity functional training version of MRF, where we're at 85 to 95% of our heart rate, sorry, the science isn't there, but do we check the box overall of what science says is that, yes, we're using sustained oxygen for a long duration, or we are creating an oxygen debt. If we're doing one of those two things, we are improving our VO2 max. So again, you take this concept and start to utilize it in your training. You can really start to do anything that you want, and that's where we fit in with concurrent training. We're able to fit in all these methods while keeping your brain engaged and changing things up, and also helping people see a ton of progress. So for all of our athletes out there utilizing our training, now you got to get to see behind the curtains of how my brain works when I'm programming things, and why things might not always look so structured if you're coming from another, style of programming. Like it's not always okay, 80% heart rate today, 90%. Like we are looking at broader concepts of, okay, are we checking the boxes to increase VO2 max? Yes. So if you're one of our athletes, thank you so much for sticking with the training. If you're interested in this, you want someone to program it for you. Like I've basically told you how to do this on your own. It's not very difficult. You can go do that. Go execute those things right now. But if you'd rather have someone do it for you who's thinking about all these things, and you're not a part of Garage Gym Athlete, go to garagegymathlete.com, sign up for a free trial, and we would love to have you as a part of our training. But that's it for this one. Remember, if you don't kill comfort, comfort will kill you.